4G kids, youth, if you are still in this room around here, you guys can get on out of here. Follow Billy and Jason and Kareen and have fun. And make sure you come back, because we like you. So see ya. Come back and have a good time. You need to grab your Bibles and open it to page 617. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5. We're going to read the whole chapter. The series of messages that we're on right now is called Into the Fire. And that's because every single day and every single week we face little decisions in our lives. And those little decisions are the choice between doing something easy and doing something difficult. The choice between maybe doing the right thing and doing the easy thing. That's often where the choices come down. And if we choose the right thing, that's going to possibly lead us into these little places of fire, places of difficulty and places of discomfort. And so we've been using this into the fire metaphor to say we are people who are willingly going to walk into those places of discomfort because we know the truth. And the truth is that God is in charge. And for those people who walk into those places of discomfort because they're following God, He shows up there. He shows up there in the fire, and He brings blessing on the other side of it. And so as people of faith, we don't have to worry about the feeling of discomfort for the moment. We can walk straight on into it, knowing God's going to take us through it. So, we've been in the book of Daniel, and we've seen this time and time again. A little bit of review. In 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree that the people of Jerusalem should be captured. He's the king of Babylon, and he sends his soldiers to Jerusalem, the land that God had promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all those people that forms the entire Old Testament. This is the land, this is the city where the temple of God was, where the palace of King David was. And Nebuchadnezzar says it's time to get them. And so he sends his soldiers, and they go there, and rather than just conquering the land first off, what they do is they strip the city of its best and its brightest people. And so Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree. Bring back to me all the best, all the brightest, all the smartest, all the handsomest, all the wealthiest, and all the wisest, and bring them back to Babylon. And so they do. And three guys and a guy named Daniel, so 4 guys total. Daniel, his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, sometimes known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Rack, Shack, and Benny, if you care. These guys come from Jerusalem, and they are brought all the way to Babylon, and there they are. And there Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree that they should eat the royal food. And Daniel and his friends oppose the king and say, we will not eat the royal food because it doesn't fall in line with our God's will for us and the kind of food He told us He wants us to eat. And so they go to the test, the trial, the moment of fire for them, and God shows up. And they become the healthiest, they become the best, they become the brightest, they become the top of all of the other candidates. And King Nebuchadnezzar learns a lesson, that God is in charge. It doesn't last, though. In chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree, and the decree is that all of the wise men of the area should be killed because none of them can interpret the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel and his 3 friends oppose the king and say, don't kill us. We will go talk to our God. And so Nebuchadnezzar puts them on trial, gives them the test. They walk through the fire of spending a night in prayer, wondering if God will reveal Himself. And yes, God shows up. And He gives them the answer to the dream. They take it to Nebuchadnezzar, and once again, Nebuchadnezzar learns the lesson that God is in charge. But it doesn't last. In chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree that all the people of Babylon should worship a statue that he's built. And Daniel's 3 friends oppose the king and say, no, we will not bow down before your statue. We will not worship your gods. And Nebuchadnezzar puts them into a fiery trial, literally sends them into a blazing hot furnace. But God shows up. And in the flames of the furnace, God meets with these 3 guys and saves their lives, preserves them, and then they're brought out. And Nebuchadnezzar sees that not a hair of their head has been singed, and he learns an important lesson, that God is always in charge. But it doesn't last. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree. I need someone to interpret another dream for me. And no one can until Daniel shows up. And Daniel opposes the king, and he says, this dream is a judgment against you. And he speaks the words of judgment against the king. And the king learns a lesson in the dream that God is in charge, but it doesn't last. And so 12 months later, he issues another decree, and this time the decree is for him, by him, about him, and it's all to him because he's standing on his palace and he says, this whole land, this whole city of Babylon is because of me. It's my glory and majesty that has built this city, and I'm responsible for how awesome it is. I must be awesome too. And God shows up. And he says, oh, no, you don't. I'm God, you're not. We'll just see who's really in charge around here. And he takes Nebuchadnezzar's sanity away from him, makes him go insane, sends him out to the wilderness where he thinks he's a cow, starts eating grass, and lives there for 7 years until God shows up and restores him to sanity, restores him to health, brings him back to his kingdom, gives him even more glory then at the end than he had given him at the start. And Nebuchadnezzar learns a lesson, that God is always in charge. Will it last? We don't know. Chapter 4 is the last time we hear of Nebuchadnezzar. But in chapter 5, we find a new king in Babylon. In chapter 5, we find a guy named Belshazzar who claims to be the son of Nebuchadnezzar, claims to be the heir of Nebuchadnezzar. And in chapter 5, what you find is that he is throwing a party with some friends of his, and a hand comes out of nowhere and writes a message on a wall. And no one can interpret it, but Daniel can. And so he comes, interprets the message as a message of judgment against the king. And that very night, the king is killed, and the entire land of Babylon is overrun, and the Persians take over. Chapter 5, we see Belshazzar get one chance when Nebuchadnezzar got chance after chance after chance in chapters 1 through 4. What's the difference between these two guys? What's the difference between a king who was very vicious, did all kinds of terrible things, and God consistently came back to him with the lesson, I'm really in charge, you didn't learn it yet, we'll learn it again. I'm really in charge, you didn't learn it yet, we'll learn it again. I'm really in charge, you didn't learn it yet, we'll learn it again. And God gives Nebuchadnezzar chance after chance after chance to learn this lesson. But Belshazzar throws a party for his friends. That's it. He throws a party for his friends, and God says, you're done. What's the difference between these two situations? And what's the difference between these two guys? And how might you and I get a couple extra chances with God when we might not deserve it? Go ahead and flip with me to read verses 1 through 16. Daniel chapter 5. It's kind of a long section. I'm going to encourage you to pay attention with your own Bibles in front of you. I'm going to try to make the story feel as lively as I can, but it is long, and so just kind of track with me. Keep going. Keep up. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I've heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Now, there's a tiny little thing that he says in here that we might just read past if we weren't paying attention. But if you were paying attention, you saw it twice, and you were probably asking, what's that all about? And it's the phrase that he will make Daniel the third highest in the kingdom. Why the third highest? What's significant about the third? Back in Exodus, the ancient book of Exodus, Joseph gets to Pharaoh in Egypt, and he interprets a dream, and Pharaoh says, "I'll make you the second highest in the kingdom. You'll be in charge of everything except for me." And earlier, when Joseph was in this dude's house named Potiphar, he was made second in charge of that guy's house. And when he was in the prison, he was made second in charge of all of the prison. And so that's sort of the standard we're looking at. Why would this king offer Daniel number 3? You can take slot number 3. Maybe someone else already has number 2. Maybe he's got a buddy, and that buddy, he promised, hey, if when I become king, I'll let you be number 2 in charge with me. Or maybe he's talking about his wife, the queen. Maybe she's number 1. So he's looking at Daniel and he says, "I'll make you number 2. Well, there's actually a real historical reason why Daniel is going to be called number 3 if he gets this thing. There's a historical reason, and that is because nowhere in any Babylonian record is Belshazzar ever called king. Now, this is interesting. His father, Nabonidus, a name we learned last week, his father, Nabonidus, is the king, is the emperor of the whole land. Belshazzar is never called king in any of the secular records, which is fascinating. Until then, you learn a little more of the story, and you realize that Nabonidus spent a good number of years in a land called Tema, which is not the city of Babylon. He's now up north in a land called Tema. And so since Nabonidus has gone away on a business trip, he's left his son back in Babylon, and he said to him, "Okay, dude, I'm going away. You're in charge while I'm gone. And here's the deal. No parties. I'm leaving you the house. I'm leaving you the palace. I want to go away. I want to come back and know that you've taken care of everything. No parties, no wild hanging out with your friends, none of all this stuff. You're in charge. Oh, by the way, I just recently replastered that wall, so please make sure nothing happens to it. So I'm going away." So this is what's going on. It's like the dad saying to the son, "You're in charge while I'm gone." And this actually was commonly done back then. It was called co-regency, where one king actually gave a portion of his kingdom to his son before the father king died, so that the son could kind of become king. And so here's Belshazzar calling himself king. On top of that, he doesn't even refer to his father by name. He refers to Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, as his father. Because Belshazzar is trying to make sure people know he's the king. He's in charge. Yeah, I know I can only make you third highest in the kingdom, but I'm the king, and nobody beats me. That just came from Seinfeld a long time ago, and it was I'm the Wiz, but I don't know. It's crazy. That's the way my brain works. So here's the thing. He's there in Babylon, and he just decides, I need to let everybody know that I'm in charge. Let's throw a party, a big party. Get 1,000 people to show up. Something happens during the party. Everybody's drinking. Everybody's having fun. And Belshazzar doesn't feel like the king yet. He doesn't feel all the way kingly. He feels like he needs to somehow do something to show off a little bit more. He needs to do something to raise his standing just a little bit higher. What can he do? And he remembers that his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, the guy he's really looking up to, that guy stole some holy articles from the temple in Jerusalem years and years ago. I know I will get those gold goblets and those things. I'll bring them, and me and all my bros, we're going to drink from those cups. And we're going to say, yeah, look at us. We're the ones who have the golden goblets from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And so he issues a decree. Bring the goblets here. And the goblets come, and they drink. And he's using the things that belong to God to get himself a little more recognition. Now, that never happens today, does it? People don't ever use God's stuff to boost themselves a little bit. No one in the Yellow Pages will ever put a little Jesus fish next to his business name because he's trying to get other people to realize, hey, he's a good person. Call him. No one will ever say to someone, oh, God bless you, because they want to look like they're nice. Yeah, I guess we do that quite a lot. We take the things of God and we somehow pull them away from Him. And then we use them for our own glory somehow. Anything can be that. I go to church, you don't. I'm a Christian, you're not. Whatever. We use these things that really belong to God and we use them for our own glory. But that's not even the main point of what's happening here. It's just kind of a sideline, because here's this king and he's trying to be something that he's really not. But he says, this is what I've got to do. And maybe you've already heard the similarity between chapter 5 and the other chapters I already reviewed. Maybe you got a little bit of that similarity. You know, there's something that's confusing. No one knows how to do it. Let's get Daniel. He'll solve the problem. He comes. He solves the problem. It's just like chapter 2, just like chapter 4. But there's a huge difference between chapter 5 and the other chapters we saw before. And maybe you'll hear it again. Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree that they should eat the food, and Daniel and his 3 friends opposed him. Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree that all the wise men should be killed, and Daniel and his friends opposed him. Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree that everybody should worship this idol, and Daniel's 3 friends opposed him. Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree that he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and Daniel opposed him, and God opposed him. And in chapter 5, Belshazzar issues a decree that they should bring the golden goblets and drink out of them. And it happens. It happened. This is the first time in the book that the king issued the decree, and it happened. There was no one standing nearby to say, whoa there. Here's the first difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. The first difference is this. Nebuchadnezzar had God-fearing people around him to challenge him. Nebuchadnezzar had put Daniel in his position and had given these other 3 guys their position so that they would be near him, they would be around him, they would be the chief astrologers, whatever it was that they would be at the top of that list. Nebuchadnezzar put them there because he saw God at work in them and he wanted them near him. There's no one around Belshazzar to say, whoa, no, don't go there. And so for Belshazzar, he tries to do something, even though it's small. Let's drink out of God's cups. And he gets his way. No one stops him. Let's move on, because when Daniel shows up, he issues the judgment. In verse 17, we get the interpretation. We're going to read 17 pretty much through the rest of the chapter, just so you can see how it ends. 17, then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself. I just love that line. I'm going to give you purple and gold. I'm going to make you number 3 in the kingdom. And Daniel's like, whatever, keep it. I don't need it. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. God's in charge, and you didn't honor him even though you honored rocks. Verse 24, therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Now I'm going to come to this interpretation in just a moment. Let me take just a break and talk a little bit about what we just covered. See, Daniel only has to glance at the room. He sees the words on the wall, glances at the room, and he immediately knows what's going on. He sees what they're drinking out of. He sees the kind of party they're having, and he sees the writing on the wall, and he knows exactly what's going on. And he says to the king, basically this: your father, Nebuchadnezzar, really his grandfather, your father was given tons of authority and could do anything he wanted. But if he didn't recognize that God was in charge, God would humble him. And then God brought him back up. But you, Belshazzar, have not done it, even though you knew it. See, that little phrase there is giving us another hint into what's different about Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. See, when Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem, that was his first encounter with these people who worshiped the God they claimed was the king of all gods, the God that they claimed had created heaven and earth, the God that had spoken to Moses in a burning bush and called himself I am, the God who they referred to as Yahweh. This was Nebuchadnezzar's first encounter with Yahweh. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to issue a decree. These Yahweh followers oppose me and they win. He must be in charge, and I'll forget it. I'll issue a decree. And these Yahweh followers oppose me, and he shows up, and they win. And after 4 chapters of that, Nebuchadnezzar finally is beginning to learn the lesson that Yahweh is the real God. But he was learning the whole time. Belshazzar is in a totally different position because he knows it. See, the lesson was learned already by Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar should have known it. He didn't need to go through the whole process. He knew it. He knew that his grandfather had gone out to the wilderness and had lived like an ox. And he still didn't humble himself. The difference between these two guys? Belshazzar knew more. So Nebuchadnezzar had godly people around him, and Belshazzar knew more. Put those two things together, and you're beginning to get a sense of why it is that Nebuchadnezzar got lots of chances, it seemed, and Belshazzar only had this one moment. But let's look at the words that were written on the wall. This is the inscription that was written. Verse 25, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. Man, Belshazzar had to have been drunk, don't you think? I mean, here's Daniel just saying, by the way, your kingdom is going to be taken from you. And you are a loser, and God thinks your time is up. So it's all over for you. And Belshazzar's like, okay, take the gold. and wear the purple, and you can be number 3. I love you, man. Well, a lot of good number 3 does. Look what happens next. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So Daniel was named number 3 in the kingdom of Babylon, which lasts about 4 more hours. And that's it. That's why Daniel's like, you can keep whatever you got. It's going to be worthless in about 4 hours. Let's look back at these words. I was always confused as a kid. These look like words that anyone who spoke that language should be able to understand. But one thing that's important to remember is that this is kind of like Wheel of Fortune when you don't have any money to buy a vowel. Because in the old ancient times, their language of writing had no vowels. Hebrew and Aramaic both were consonantal languages. They only used consonants. And every word was made of a root of 3 consonants. And those 3 consonants, depending on the vowels you put with them, the vowels you pronounce them with, they could be nouns or verbs or anything like that. I mean, they could be adjectives because the 3 consonants gave you kind of the root meaning of that thing. And then how you pronounced it was the different meaning that it had. But when you wrote it, you only wrote the consonants. You didn't write the vowels. Now, today, we actually have a system of vowels for Hebrew reading and stuff like that. And so if you have a letter M, an equivalent to the letter M, with 3 dots underneath it in a triangle, that should be pronounced like me, something like that. Me or me, or me or may, those 2. And that's the way it works. But now there's a hand that wrote something on the wall, and it's got no vowels with it because they just got letters. And so we have to see it the way they might have seen it. And so it kind of looks a little bit like this. Now, I'm using English-style letters. I'm not using Hebrew letters. And the little apostrophe there is because there's one letter in the Hebrew alphabet that you can't pronounce. No one can pronounce it, to my knowledge. Not even Hebrews pronounce it. And so I could use a hash mark. That would have been cool because everybody likes hash marks. But I just used an apostrophe because that's traditional. And then this is also going from left to right, not right to left, the way they would have read it and the way it would have been written on the wall. But there it is. Mythical person. Because I'm in the mood for it today. I think, man, tackle the person. That's what I'm thinking. But what they saw it as, the ancient Babylonians standing there seeing this handwriting on the wall, they're probably thinking in terms of nouns. And so they gave this noun vowels. And the noun vowels would have been like this: mina, tekel, and uparsin. And for them, all of those 3 unique words could have been money words. Mina was a unit of measurement for a large amount of money. Tekel was a unit of measurement that the Hebrews called shekel. They called it a tekel. And so it was the smaller amount of money. And then uparsin, in the context of these other words, could mean half shekel or half of the previous thing. And so they're looking at this and they're like, okay, so the money's going down. This is like one of those bad stock market reports. It's kind of going down. Maybe this is an economic judgment against us. We don't know. But Daniel shows up and he's like, no, there are other vowels we could put there. And if we make all these words verbs, we get something very different. And if you make them all verbs, you get the way Daniel described it, which is mene, tekel, and perez. And these verbs mean these 3 thoughts. Your time is up. You've failed your chance. And you've lost everything. Mene means you've been measured and the end of the ruler has been reached. Your time is up. Tekel means you've been weighed, but it's not heavy enough. You've had your chance, you missed the mark, you failed the chance. And then the last one is it's divided. What you had is taken from you, split up, you've lost everything. And then on top of it, that last word there has this weird extra double meaning that Daniel sees because God told him about it, and it's this. Those same 4 letters also mean Persian. And Persian, ironically, was a divided kingdom anyway. It was the Persians and the Medes who had together formed an empire. And that's why the Medes end up controlling Babylon at the end of this chapter, even though the Persians are really the real kingdom. They're the real empire. And so Daniel looks at this and he says, your kingdom is going to be divided and given to the Persians. Daniel sees all this meaning in these words. And he's issued the judgment to the king. The thing though, that almost breaks my heart is to think of how sad these words really are. Your time is up. You failed your chance. You've lost everything. Your time is up. You failed your chance. You've lost everything. How terrible would it be to hear those words? I mean, ultimately, these words are trying to communicate that God's the one in charge. God's the one who puts a message on the wall to the king to say, I'm the one who measures you. I'm the one who evaluates you. I'm the judge. I'm in charge, and your time is done. Now, up until this point, the phrase God's in charge has been encouraging. In chapters 1, 2, and 3, to know that God is in charge means that the people who followed God, God is going to meet them in the midst of their fire, and He's going to walk with them through it and bring them to a place of blessing. And so for God to be in charge, it means the blessing comes when I follow Him. And then even in chapter 4, it begins to get a little edge there, because for God to be in charge, it means He has to get Nebuchadnezzar. He has to take away his sanity, send him out into the wilderness, make him into like an animal. And so there you see the edge to God being in charge, where He's willing to go ahead and put someone down into their place. But it has a silver lining, because He brings Nebuchadnezzar back. He restores him. But here in chapter 5, the phrase God is in charge means nothing encouraging whatsoever. It just means your time's up. You failed your chance. You've lost everything. We tend to look at life like it's all these little fiery moments. And some we go into and through, and some we avoid. And we look at all these fiery moments, and they affect us all differently, and we've tried our best to learn how to manage them. But God doesn't look at it that way. He doesn't look at these little tiny fiery moments. He looks at your entire life like it's one big test. And at the end is when the fire shows up. At the end is when it all gets evaluated. There's coming a moment that God would say, your time is up. Put the pencils down. Stop writing. The test is over. It's time to be graded. And crazy enough, the Bible uses this word fire to talk about that moment. And it's not just the Old Testament, it's the New Testament too. It's not just the God of wrath in the Old Testament and the God of love in the New Testament. No, the God in the New Testament is the same as the God in the Old Testament. And He says there's fire coming at the end of this journey. See what it says here in Revelation? It says the lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. At the end of time, God is going to have that one test. Is your name in the book or not? And if it's not, fire. In Matthew, Jesus says basically the same thing. He says, the judge, talking about himself in the future, then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. He's going to judge. And some people are going to end up in a place of fire. In Hebrews 10, if we deliberately keep on sinning after we've received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and of raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. These are 3 different books, 3 different authors, and they all are united in saying this: there's fire coming. There is a moment when your time will be up, and the next thing after that is some moment of fire. And this one is even scarier. Because if you've got the knowledge, you're more responsible. Just like Belshazzar. If you got the knowledge, you're more responsible. There's another passage here that Paul writes. Paul says this: if anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. There, Paul is also talking about this moment at the end where fire is going to test everyone. This fire is going to touch everyone's life. And then see what it says. If it's burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. Now, this is weird. This is more like chapter 4, silver lining. There's a moment here where Paul says, no, there is still hope. Yes, there's fire at the end, but there's hope. And there's this one tiny shred of hope that even if you build a terrible building, and even if it's flammable to the hilt, and it just goes up and it's gone and it's completely burned up, if the foundation is solid, then you can still survive. You can still stand through this final test, through this final judgment. If the foundation is there, you might escape through the flames, but you'll still be on solid ground. What's the foundation? Well, actually, it was right before we started reading. In verse 11, Paul says this, "For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ." See, Paul's claim, along with all these other New Testament writers, is that fire is coming. There's coming a time when God will say, your time is up. And now, let's do the test. And there's going to be this moment of fiery test of some kind, and for some people, they will survive with what they've done. And for some people, they will survive, but not with what they've done. And for some people, they won't survive at all. They won't make it through. But the foundation that lets you make it through is Jesus Christ. According to what Paul is teaching there, it's Jesus. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament about this. And there's a passage that I desperately want you to be familiar with. It's in Hebrews chapter 10, one of the richest, most blessed chapters in the Bible. I love it, but it's also really hard to understand. And so I'm going to read a few sections from it after I give you your next blank. And when we get to that, I want to help you understand what it means and close out our time. Our next blank is this. The difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and us is that we know about Jesus. We know about Jesus. Nebuchadnezzar got lots of chances. Belshazzar knew what he should have known and only got one chance. But we know one thing more. We know about Jesus. And we know that a life built on His foundation is a life that survives the final fire. So, here's this section from Hebrews. Let me see if I can make it through pretty quickly. He says this, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain that is His body. And since we have a great priest over the house of God," Paul is saying, or whoever's writing Hebrews is saying, we have confidence to go before God. And so let me just summarize it. It looks like this. Since we have access to God through Jesus. File that. Since we have access to God through Jesus. He then says, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and full assurance that faith brings. And then he talks about how our conscience is cleansed. And then we can hold on to a hope because God is faithful. Here's the summary of that. Since we can go to God through Jesus, let's go to God in faith. Let's believe that He will receive us and go to Him. And then he says this to end it. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. He says this, encourage each other because time is running out. Let me summarize this. There is coming a moment when God says time's running out, when God says time is up. And after He says your time is up, what is the next thing He will say to you? Will He say, you failed your chance? Will He say, sorry, everything's burned and you don't have a foundation? Or will He say, come on in? Since we have access to God through Jesus, let's go to God in faith and encourage each other because time is running out. Let me close out our time. After you read the result and you realize that Babylon was destroyed, we realize once again that no matter what it looks like, God is in charge. God is in charge. Your dad's away. It's your chance to be independent, to be Mr. Big Shot. You think you can make a name for yourself and do your thing? Nope, God's in charge. You're going through a hard time and you're not exactly sure what it's all about or what it means, and you're worried about it. But guess what? God is in charge. And as a matter of fact, it's not a bad thing to let Him be in charge. Let me give you 3 things to take home with you this week. Ways for you to get your chances with God secure. Okay? 3 ways. Your chances with God flow from these 3 things. 3 things we saw in our passage today. Willingness, number 1, to be close to His people. Your chances with God flow from, number 1, your willingness to be close to God's people. You get some people around you who can tell you no, and you just got another chance. Number 2, your chances with God flow from your willingness to obey what you know. Your willingness to obey what you know. God says something, you do it, you get another chance. And finally, above them all and more important than them all, your chances with God flow from your willingness to make Jesus your foundation. Make Jesus your foundation. Listen, I meet people all the time who are in dire straits. Financial hardship, emotional ruin, all kinds of crazy problems. I mean, soap operas exist in the real world. You probably know some people, maybe you've been there, maybe you are there now. But I will say this, I regularly meet soap opera type of people. But I have never once met a soap opera person who could say yes to all 3 of these things that we just mentioned. I am close with God's people. I am living in obedience, and I have put my life on the foundation of Jesus. That hasn't happened. I've met people who have struggled with one of those 3 and have found themselves in soap opera moments. But people who are solidly on Jesus are like, I know He's in charge. And they have an internal stability. And people who are close to God's people are not making the stupid kind of decisions that get them into some of those troubles. You know? And people who are obeying God when He says do something are also on solid ground. So here's the deal. I don't want any one of you to ever hear God say those 3 phrases. Your time is up. You failed your chance. And you've lost it all. I don't want anyone in this room to ever find themselves in a Belshazzar position. And the problem is none of us know how many Nebuchadnezzar positions we're going to have, how many chances we're going to get, how much longer God is going to last with us and say, okay, let's just do this again. We don't know. But we do know this. We've got now. We've got today, and we can make sure our foundation is clear. There's a passage in Hebrews 4 that I'm going to close with, leave you with, and then ask you to sort of reflect on as we sing our final song. It says this, so God's rest is there for people to enter, but those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering His rest, and that time is today. Today, when you hear His voice, don't harden your hearts. I just want to ask you, if you've never said, Jesus is my foundation, then today, do it. Make it real. If you've been toying with Jesus as your foundation, but you haven't yet stepped into obedience, make a commitment today. What's it going to take for me to begin to learn to walk in obedience with Him? And if you've been working on these 2 things and you're struggling, maybe your problem is that you just haven't really plugged into God's people. And you don't have the people around you who can encourage you and support you and strengthen you the way you need. Make a decision today to do whatever it takes to surround yourself with some solidly great, God-fearing people. And you put those 3 things together, and I believe you will experience incredible blessing. But I want to ask you to take out your card and jot down some thoughts right now. To close your eyes maybe, to enter into a moment of prayer and reflection, to maybe jot some thoughts down on that card. But I'll ask you clearly. If you've never given your heart to Jesus, don't wait. Today's the day. Time is up. Pencil's down. Test is up. What's he going to say? Make sure about it now. Let's pray.
Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.